I've always preferred hiking alone. It's not that I don't like people. I just like the quiet. There's something peaceful about moving through the woods with nothing but your own thoughts, away from the noise of the world. I've done dozens of solo hikes over the years, some short, some multi-day trips deep in the backcountry. I plan them carefully, pack light but smart, and always stick to my route. This one was supposed to be no different. I had picked a remote section of forest, an old trail that wasn't well traveled. It wasn't an official route anymore, just something that had been used years ago but had since fallen off the maps. I found it through an old hiking forum where people shared forgotten trails, places where you wouldn't run into anyone for miles. That's exactly what I wanted. I left my truck at the base of the trail just after sunrise. The morning air was crisp, and the sky was clear. Perfect hiking weather. My pack was snug on my shoulders, my boots were broken in, and I had my GPS, my compass, and a paper map just in case. The first few miles were easy. The trail was narrow but visible, winding through thick trees and following the curve of a ridge. I made good time, stopping only to drink water and check my bearings. The deeper I went, the more overgrown the path became, but I expected that. I had planned for it. What I hadn't planned for was what happened next. I was about 4 hours in when I noticed something strange. The trail I had been following just stopped. Not in the usual way where it fades into overgrowth and you have to pick your way through. This was different. One moment there was a clear path. The next, nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, no sign that anyone had walked here in years. I frowned, checking my GPS. It still showed I was on the right path. I pulled out my compass and double-checked my position. According to everything I had, I was still where I was supposed to be. But looking around, I could see that wasn't true. The forest didn't match my map. The ridge should have been on my right, sloping down toward a small river. But the land here was flat, dense with trees that weren't supposed to be this close together. Felt wrong. I turned back the way I came, thinking maybe I had veered off without realizing it. But after a few steps, I stopped. The trail was gone. Not overgrown. Not hidden. Just gone. My stomach tightened. I knew better than to panic. I had trained for this, read survival books, watched videos on how to handle being lost in the woods. Stay calm. Use your tools. Retrace your steps. I took a deep breath and pulled out my map again. If I couldn't find the trail, I could at least navigate back to my truck by following the terrain. I marked my last known location and picked a direction that should take me back to where I started. I walked and walked and walked, but nothing changed. The trees all looked the same, tall and straight, their trunks packed too close together. The ground was covered in thick underbrush that I didn't remember passing through earlier. No landmarks, no clearing, just endless forest stretching in every direction. I checked my GPS again, but now it was frozen. The screen showed my last location, but the tracker wasn't moving. I switched to my compass and adjusted my course, pushing through the thick brush. My breathing was steady, but I could feel my pulse creeping up. Then I saw something that made me stop. A tree stripped of its bark. At first, it didn't seem unusual. Trees get damaged. Whether animals, disease, it happens. But as I stepped closer, I saw the marks. Deep, precise cuts like something or someone had stripped the bark on purpose. The exposed wood underneath was fresh, the edges still raw. I swallowed hard. I wasn't alone out here. I kept moving, faster now, forcing my way through the dense brush. I had to get back to the truck. I had to get out. But the further I went, the more wrong everything felt. The air was heavy, thick with the smell of damp earth and something else, something metallic. The silence was unnatural. No birds, no wind, just the sound of my own breathing. Then I found the rope. It was stretched between two trees at chest height, nearly invisible against the bark. My foot caught it just as I saw it, and I stumbled forward, barely catching myself before hitting the ground. I stared at it, my heart pounding. It wasn't an accident. Someone had put it there. I spun around, scanning the trees, my skin crawling. Nothing. No movement. No sound. I was being hunted. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Someone had led me off the trail. Someone had been waiting. I turned and ran. I didn't care about the map, the compass, the route. I just ran. Branches tore at my clothes. My pack bounced against my back. But I didn't stop. My legs burned. My lungs ached. But I pushed forward, crashing through the undergrowth, desperate to get away. Then I saw it. A figure, standing just ahead, half hidden behind the trees. Tall, motionless, watching me. I didn't stop to look. I veered left, sprinting downhill, my boots slipping on loose dirt. My breath came in ragged gasps, my vision blurred with sweat. I could hear something behind me, footsteps, fast, close. I broke into a clearing and nearly collapsed with relief. There, just beyond the trees, I could see the road. My truck. I didn't slow down. I sprinted across the gravel, yanking the door open and throwing myself inside. My hands shook as I jammed the keys into the ignition. The engine roared to life. I hit the gas, tearing out onto the road, my tires kicking up dust. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. I just drove. It wasn't until I was miles away, back on the highway, that I let myself breathe. My hands were still shaking, my shirt soaked with sweat. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing on the side of the road. But there was nothing, just empty forest. I don't know who was out there. I don't know how they led me off the trail. But I do know one thing. I'll never hike alone again. I was heading east on I-15, just outside of Las Vegas, pushing through the quietest hours of the night. The clock on my dash read 3:02 a.m. The desert stretched out in every direction, dark and empty, with nothing but low hills and scattered shrubs breaking up the land. A full moon hung in the sky, casting just enough light to see the edges of the road without my high beams. The radio had given up miles ago, only catching bits and pieces of static, so I was driving in silence, listening to the hum of my tires on the asphalt and the steady rumble of my engine. I had been following 3 black SUVs for the past hour. They weren't speeding or doing anything erratic, just cruising along at a steady pace, a few car lengths apart, like they were moving together. What caught my eye at first were their plates. Nevada tags, but not normal ones. Just single-digit numbers in sequence, 1, 2, 3. That wasn't something you saw every day. I'm not one to get nosy about other drivers on the road. People drive all sorts of weird cars at night, and I've learned not to overthink it. But something about these SUVs bugged me. They looked identical, blacked-out windows, no visible markings, nothing to say if they were government, private security, or something else entirely. And they weren't passing or slowing down, just keeping their steady pace like they were in no hurry. I kept my distance, staying back but not far enough to lose sight of them. Around 3:20, without any warning, all 3 SUVs flicked their turn signals on at the exact same time. I didn't see a sign for an exit. There were no streetlights, no markers, not even a worn path in the dirt, just open desert. But they turned anyway, right off the highway, onto what looked like nothing more than loose gravel and sand. And then, as soon as they were off the road, their lights shut off completely. 1 second they were there, and the next just black shapes in the desert, swallowed by the night. I felt my stomach tighten. There was nothing out there. No buildings, no power lines, no sign of a ranch or a business. Just dirt and silence. And yet, those SUVs had turned like they knew exactly where they were going. I kept driving. I told myself I didn't care what they were doing. The desert was full of weird stuff. Military installations, private airstrips, even secretive rich guys who bought up land to do God knows what in the middle of nowhere. It wasn't my problem. I was just a trucker hauling freight, trying to get to my next stop without trouble. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I had seen something I wasn't supposed to. I checked my mirrors every few seconds, half expecting to see headlights appear behind me again. Nothing, just darkness. The further I got from that turnoff, the more the back of my neck itched. About 15 minutes later, I spotted a rest stop sign. I wasn't tired, but I wanted to pull over for a minute, stretch my legs, maybe splash some cold water on my face. The turnoff was a half-mile ahead. I flipped my signal on and eased off the highway. The rest stop was empty. A couple of vending machines sat near the entrance, buzzing under yellowed fluorescent lights. There was a single sedan parked near the bathrooms, but I didn't see anyone around. I climbed down from my cab, stretching my arms and rolling my shoulders. The air was still warm, even this late at night. I leaned against my truck and looked out over the highway, half expecting to see those SUVs again in the distance. But the road was empty. I let out a breath and rubbed my eyes. Maybe I was making too much of it. Maybe it was nothing. I decided to grab a drink from the vending machine. I walked over, dug a couple of quarters out of my pocket, and pressed the button for a bottle of water. The machine whirred, the bottle dropped, and I bent down to grab it. And that's when I noticed the footprints. They weren't mine. A few feet away, leading from the edge of the rest stop toward the vending machines, were fresh boot prints in the dust, the kind left by thick-soled military or tactical boots. I stood up slowly and looked around. The rest stop was dead silent. No wind.
No rustling bushes.
Nothing. The footprints were deep, like whoever made them had been walking with purpose. But they stopped near the vending machine, like someone had stood there, watching. I felt a tightness in my chest. I glanced back at my truck, suddenly aware of how exposed I was standing out in the open. I turned quickly and walked back, climbing into the cab and locking the door behind me. I sat there for a moment, gripping the wheel, listening to my own breathing. Then I checked my mirrors again. Nothing. I reached down, put the truck in gear, and pulled out of the rest stop, getting back onto the highway as fast as I could. For the next hour, I kept checking my mirrors, watching the road behind me. But I never saw those SUVs again. By the time the sun started creeping up over the horizon, the whole thing felt like a bad dream. But when I stopped for fuel later that morning, I got out and checked the dust on my truck. There were more footprints, right by my driver's side door. That was the last time I ever stopped along that stretch of highway at night. It wasn't supposed to be anything special. A short hike in the woods just to clear my mind. I'd taken this route before, nothing more than a few hours' walk through familiar trails. The kind of thing you do to unwind, not expecting anything to change. But tonight, things felt different. I'd left home around dusk, just as the sun was dipping below the horizon. The woods were still lit by the last rays of light, casting long shadows across the path ahead. The air was cool, with the faint scent of pine and wet earth. I had my backpack with a bottle of water, some snacks, and a flashlight, just in case. I wasn't worried. I'd done this before and knew these woods like the back of my hand. I hadn't planned on staying too long, but as I walked, the beauty of the forest drew me in. The way the trees lined the path, their branches reaching out like a canopy, made it feel like I was walking in a secret world. The chirping of birds had died down, but there were still the occasional rustles in the underbrush, a rabbit or a squirrel, maybe a fox. It was peaceful, almost soothing. The sun set faster than I expected, and soon, the woods were plunged into a thick, inky darkness. I clicked on my flashlight, the beam of light cutting through the shadows, but even with the flashlight, the woods felt oppressive. The trees seemed taller now, and the sounds of the forest seemed to fade away. All I could hear was the crunch of my boots against the dirt and leaves, and my own breathing, steady but a little quicker than usual. I'd planned to reach the creek by nightfall. The sound of water would make for a perfect spot to sit and take a break. But by the time I arrived at the usual clearing near the stream, something felt off. The place seemed quieter than usual, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I took a step into the clearing, my flashlight casting long, strange shadows over the ground. I stopped and looked around. There was no wind, no sound, just the stillness. For a moment, I wondered if I'd missed something. The creek usually had a certain noise, the trickling of water over rocks, but it was eerily quiet. I glanced at the stream, and sure enough, there was no water. The creek was dry. It wasn't just low, it was completely barren. I walked over to the bank and knelt down to inspect it. The ground was cracked, the dirt parched. No water had flowed through here in days, maybe weeks. I couldn't understand it. There was no logical reason for a creek to dry up like this in the middle of summer. I rubbed the back of my neck, uneasy. This place had always been here, and it had always had water. I stood up, the flashlight trembling slightly in my hand. A rustle came from the trees behind me, just on the edge of the clearing. It wasn't a small noise, like a squirrel. It was deliberate, heavy, as if something larger had moved through the brush. I turned, shining the light in the direction of the noise, but the beam only revealed a few tangled branches and some low bushes. Nothing out of the ordinary. I stood still for a moment, listening. The rustling had stopped. I should have turned back. Something about the woods felt different tonight, and my instinct was screaming at me to leave. But instead, I told myself it was just my imagination. It had to be. There was nothing out here. I couldn't be the only one in these woods. People hiked here all the time. I moved deeper into the forest, following the narrow trail that would eventually lead back to the parking lot. But with every step, the air seemed to thicken. The trees seemed to lean in closer, and the path became less defined. It was as if the forest was swallowing me whole. I should have been able to find my way back by now, but the darkness made everything look unfamiliar. I checked my watch. It wasn't that late, but something was wrong. The woods felt too quiet, too still. My flashlight beam shook as I turned around, checking behind me. But there was nothing. No sounds of animals, no distant rustling, no wind. Just an oppressive silence. I walked faster now, my heart beginning to beat harder in my chest. The trees seemed to be growing closer together, the branches tangled in a way that made it feel like the path was narrowing. It was harder to see even with the flashlight. The beam of light flickered for a second, and when it came back on, the forest had changed. It wasn't the same. The trees seemed more twisted, their bark dark and rough. The branches gnarled like fingers reaching out to grab me. The path ahead was now barely visible. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat. Something wasn't right. The woods had always been dark at night, but this wasn't just darkness. It was something more. I turned around, but there was no sign of the clearing, no sign of the creek. I was deep in the woods now, and the path I had been following had disappeared completely. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine as I realized that I had no idea where I was. My phone was in my backpack, but I hadn't thought to check it. Now, I didn't want to. I could feel it. The woods were alive in a way they hadn't been before. I tried to move forward, but the trees now seemed to block my way. The air felt thick and heavy, pressing in on me. I stepped off the path and into the brush, my boots crunching on the dry leaves, but the ground seemed to give way underneath me. I stumbled, my ankle twisting as I caught myself on a nearby tree. Pain shot up my leg, but I didn't have time to think about it. I had to get out. I pushed forward, my mind racing. I was lost, completely lost. The flashlight was the only thing that kept me from completely losing my bearings, but the beam was weak now, flickering with every step. I didn't know how much longer the batteries would last. Suddenly, I heard it again. A sound from behind me, the rustling, that same deliberate movement through the brush. This time, it was closer, too close. My heart hammered in my chest, and I spun around, shining the flashlight into the darkness. But there was nothing there, just trees, shadows. I froze. A shape moved in the distance just at the edge of the light. It was large, too large to be an animal. I blinked, trying to focus, but the shadows played tricks on my eyes. My throat tightened, and I tried to tell myself it was just the forest, just the wind, but something inside me screamed to run, and so I did. I bolted down the path, my legs aching, my breath coming in sharp gasps. The flashlight flickered again, and for a brief moment, everything went black. I cursed under my breath, desperately tapping the side of the flashlight. It flickered back to life, and I saw it. The figure. It was moving through the trees, following me. It wasn't human. The shape was too tall, too long. Its movement wasn't natural. It glided between the trees, almost as if it was floating. My stomach churned with a wave of nausea. Couldn't breathe. My legs wouldn't move fast enough, and I could hear it gaining on me. I ran, faster than I ever thought possible, my pulse roaring in my ears. My foot caught on a root, and I went sprawling into the dirt. Pain shot through my body, but I didn't stop. I scrambled to my feet and kept going, my only thought to put distance between myself and whatever was following me. It wasn't until I reached the edge of the woods that I stopped. I didn't know how far I had run, but I could see the dim outline of the road ahead. The forest seemed to recede behind me, as though I had crossed some invisible line. The figure was gone, but I could still feel it in the pit of my stomach. I didn't look back. I didn't stop running until I reached the car. And even then, I didn't feel safe. The woods had changed. The trees had closed in on me in a way that was unnatural. Whatever had followed me, whatever it was, I didn't want to know. I drove home, hands shaking on the wheel, and didn't say a word to anyone about what had happened. I couldn't explain it. I couldn't explain the twisted trees, the way the forest seemed alive, or the thing I had felt watching me. All I knew was that I would never go back into those woods. Not ever. I've hiked alone for years. I know the woods better than I know most people. I've never been afraid of them. Not at night, not in bad weather, not even in deep wilderness where you're days away from help. I trust my own skills. I know how to handle myself. That's why I didn't think twice about this trip. The plan was simple. A 3-day solo hike through an old, lesser-known trail deep in the mountains. It wasn't marked on most modern maps. just an old route I had read about in an old forum post. I liked hikes like that. The more remote, the better. I parked my truck at a small turnout where the dirt road ended, checked my gear, and set off just after sunrise. The trail was barely visible, overgrown in places, but I could see the faint path where people had walked before. It led up into the dense forest, winding between towering pines and thick underbrush. For the first few miles, everything was perfect. The air was cool, the ground soft underfoot. I moved fast, covering ground, getting deeper into the forest. The trees were so thick that the light barely touched the ground in places, but I didn't mind. I liked the feeling of being enclosed by nature, the silence wrapping around me like a blanket. By midday, I reached a small clearing where I stopped to eat. I sat on a fallen log, stretching out my legs, taking in the view. The trees parted just enough to give me a glimpse of the valley far below. I had no signal on my phone, but I had expected that. I took a few pictures anyway, just to mark the moment. I didn't notice anything strange at first, but looking back, I remember the moment the feeling started. A shift, a change in the air. It wasn't anything obvious, just a stillness, a sense that something had changed without me realizing it. The forest, which had been full of the usual sounds, birds, insects, the rustle of leaves, had gone completely silent. I told myself it was nothing. Still, I packed up quickly and kept moving. The trail got rougher as I climbed higher. The brush got thicker, the path narrower. At times, I had to push through overgrown branches, feeling them scrape against my arms. It was clear that not many people came this way anymore. I liked that, but then I saw something that made me stop. A boot print. It was old, the edges softened by wind and rain, but still clear in the dirt. Someone had walked this trail before me, maybe months ago, maybe longer. That wasn't strange. It was a trail after all. People hiked it. But 100 yards later, I saw another one. This one was fresher, much fresher. The dirt was still loose around the edges. Maybe a day old, maybe less. And beside it, barely visible in the undergrowth, another print. Bare feet. I stared at it, my stomach tightening. It was probably nothing. Someone could have taken off their boots to wade through a stream. Maybe they were camping nearby. But still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I kept walking. The farther I went, the worse the feeling got. I couldn't explain it. Nothing had happened. I hadn't seen anything, hadn't heard anything. But I felt it in my chest. That tight, crawling feeling like I was being watched. By late afternoon, I found a good place to set up camp. A flat patch of ground near a small creek, surrounded by trees. It was a good spot, sheltered, quiet. I dropped my pack, stretched out my sore muscles, and got to work setting up my tent. As I unrolled my sleeping bag, I glanced back at the trail, and that's when I saw it. A figure, far up the path, just barely visible between the trees. I froze. The sun was low, casting long shadows, making it hard to see clearly. But there was something there. Person. Standing still. Too still. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just watched. And after a long moment, so long I started to wonder if my eyes were playing tricks on me, the figure moved. Not toward me. Not away. Just sideways. Stepping into the trees, vanishing into the undergrowth without a sound. I swallowed hard, my heartbeat thudding in my ears. I told myself it was a hunter, someone else hiking the trail. But deep down, I knew that wasn't right. I finished setting up camp, trying to act normal, trying to shake the feeling. I built a small fire, cooked some food, forced myself to eat even though my stomach was tight. By the time night fell, I was exhausted. But I didn't get into my tent right away. I sat by the fire, staring into the darkness, listening. Nothing, not a single sound, just the crackle of the flames and the distant trickle of the creek. I didn't like it. Eventually, I forced myself to go to bed. I zipped myself into my sleeping bag, closed my eyes, and tried to ignore the feeling that something was wrong. Then a sound, soft, distant, but unmistakable. A snap, like a twig breaking underfoot. I held my breath. Then another, closer. Someone was walking, slow, careful, right outside my camp. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. I just listened. Then silence. Minutes passed, maybe longer. I waited, my muscles locked, every sense on high alert, but nothing else happened. Eventually, I must have drifted off, because the next thing I knew, it was morning. I sat up fast, heart pounding. The fire was out. The air was cold. My tent flap was still zipped. Everything looked normal. But then I saw them. Footprints. All around my campsite. Deep prints in the dirt. Some from boots. Some from bare feet. And all of them circling my tent. I stared at them for a long time, my brain refusing to process what I was seeing. Someone had been here, watching me, standing just outside my tent while I slept. I packed up as fast as I could. No food, no rest. Just shoved everything into my pack and started moving. I hiked faster than I ever had before. My legs ached. My lungs burned. But I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I don't know how far I had gone when I finally saw it. My truck, sitting there at the edge of the woods like a lifeline. I sprinted the last stretch, threw my pack into the bed, and locked myself inside. I sat there for a long time, hands gripping the wheel, heart still hammering. Then, finally, I started the engine. As I turned onto the dirt road, I glanced in the rearview mirror, and for just a second, just long enough to make my stomach drop, I thought I saw something move in the trees. Something tall, something still, watching. I didn't stop. I didn't look again. I just drove. I don't know who or what was out there that night, but I know one thing. I'll never hike that trail again. I've camped alone more times than I can count. Some people think it's reckless, but I've always found peace in the solitude. There's something about being deep in the woods, miles from anyone else, that makes the world feel simpler.
No emails.
No traffic, just me, the trees, and the quiet. This trip was supposed to be like any other. I had planned for 3 nights out in the wilderness, far from any official campsites. I picked a spot deep in a national forest, far from trails, near a small creek. It was a perfect place. Plenty of firewood, fresh water, and total isolation. The first day went smoothly. I parked my truck on an old dirt road, hiked about 5 miles into the woods, and found a clearing big enough for my tent. The trees were thick on all sides, but there was just enough space for a fire pit and a decent view of the creek. I set up camp, gathered firewood, and cooked some simple food over the fire as the sun set. The air was cool, the smell of pine and damp earth strong. As darkness settled in, I sat by the fire, letting the warmth soak in. Nights in the woods can be unnerving if you aren't used to them. The silence isn't really silence. It's filled with distant rustling, the occasional snap of a branch, the wind moving through the trees. I've learned to tune it out. Most noises are just animals going about their business. That first night, I slept deeply, the steady sounds of the creek lulling me into unconsciousness. The second day was uneventful. I spent most of it exploring, hiking further upstream, fishing a little. The sun filtered through the trees. The scent of damp leaves filled the air, and I felt completely at peace. But as the sun started to dip, something felt different. At first, I couldn't pinpoint what it was. The air felt heavier, like a storm was coming, but the sky was clear. The woods were quieter than before. The usual evening sounds, chirping insects, rustling branches, felt more distant, like they were further away than they should be. I tried to shake it off. Maybe I was just imagining things. That night, as I sat by the fire, I kept catching myself looking over my shoulder, scanning the darkness beyond the trees. Nothing was there. I forced myself to relax, but my body wouldn't listen. The hairs on my arms stood up. My stomach felt tight. My instincts were screaming at me, but I had no reason to feel that way. I stayed up later than usual, adding more wood to the fire, keeping it burning longer than I normally would. I told myself it was just a precaution, maybe a subconscious habit from too many nights alone in the wild. Eventually, exhaustion won. I crawled into my tent, zipped it up, and forced myself to sleep. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I didn't know why. Everything was silent, too silent. I listened, barely breathing. No wind,
No insects.
no running water from the creek. Then I heard it, a soft, deliberate sound. Leaves crunching, slow, careful, not an animal. Someone was walking outside my tent. I froze, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. The steps were light, measured, as if whoever it was didn't want to be heard. I stayed perfectly still, gripping the knife I always kept near my sleeping bag. The footsteps circled my tent, slow and deliberate. Then they stopped, right next to me. I held my breath. My fingers tightened around the handle of my knife. Minutes passed. My ears strained for any sound, but there was nothing. No movement.
No retreating footsteps.
Just silence. I lay there, barely blinking, every muscle locked in place. I don't know how long I stayed like that. Felt like hours. Eventually, the exhaustion took over, and I must have drifted off, because when I opened my eyes again, light was seeping through the fabric of my tent. Morning. I sat up slowly, my entire body stiff. My first thought was that maybe I had dreamed it. Maybe it had just been my mind playing tricks. Then, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The ground was disturbed. Footprints, human footprints, circled my tent. They weren't mine. I stared at them, my stomach twisting. They came from the trees, moved around my tent, and then nothing. No footprints leading away, like whoever it was had just vanished. I packed up my camp in record time. I didn't eat, didn't stop to rest. I just stuffed everything into my pack and started hiking back toward my truck. The whole way I felt watched. Every snap of a twig, every rustling leaf made my pulse spike. When I finally reached my truck, I threw my pack in the back, locked the doors, and peeled out of there, dirt kicking up behind me. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away. Even now, I don't know who or what was out there. I never saw them, never heard them leave. But I know one thing, I wasn't alone. I didn't go to the cabin looking for trouble. I went because I needed a break. My life had been grinding me down for months, the stress piling up so high that I felt like I couldn't breathe anymore. My job had turned into an endless cycle of deadlines and expectations I could never meet. I wasn't sleeping well. I wasn't eating right. I felt like I was unraveling piece by piece, and I knew if I didn't step away for a while, I was going to fall apart. The cabin seemed like the perfect place to reset. I found it online, buried deep in the back pages of a rental site. It wasn't one of those polished vacation homes with a hot tub and a lake view. This was something different, remote, isolated, a true escape. No electricity, no plumbing, no cell service. Just a one-room structure deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest town. That was exactly what I needed. I booked it for a full week without thinking twice. That was my first mistake. The drive took almost 10 hours. I left early in the morning, only stopping once for gas before turning onto the dirt road that led to the cabin. The road was worse than I expected. Uneven, covered in deep ruts and loose rocks. The trees pressed in on both sides, thick and tangled, their branches stretching overhead and blocking out most of the sky. It felt like I was heading into a different world, one completely separate from everything I knew. After almost an hour, I reached the spot where I had to leave my truck behind. The cabin was another 4 miles in, only accessible by foot. I stepped out and stretched, rolling my shoulders. The air was crisp, fresh in a way that city air never was. The only sound was the rustling of leaves and the occasional chirp of a bird somewhere deep in the trees. I grabbed my pack from the truck bed, double-checked my gear, and started walking. The trail wasn't well marked. It was barely more than a thin strip of dirt winding through the trees, overgrown in some places, littered with fallen branches and thick with roots that made each step tricky. I kept my pace steady, focusing on the ground in front of me, the weight of my pack pressing into my shoulders. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't anything obvious, just a faint, creeping unease that settled in my gut. The forest was too quiet. Normally, you'd hear birds, insects, the distant rustling of small animals moving through the underbrush. But here there was nothing, just the sound of my own footsteps. I told myself it was just my imagination. It took nearly 2 hours to reach the cabin. I spotted it through the trees just as the sun was starting to dip lower in the sky. It was smaller than I expected. A simple wooden structure with a slanted roof, a small porch, and a single window. The wood was weathered, darkened with age, but it looked solid. There was a pile of firewood stacked neatly beside the door, an old metal chair sitting on the porch. I stepped onto the porch and pushed the door open. Inside, the air was cool and stale, the scent of dust and old wood thick in the small space. The cabin was just one room, a cot against the far wall, a small table with a wooden chair, a cast-iron stove in the corner, and a few shelves filled with supplies. Canned food, matches, an old lantern. I set my pack down and exhaled. This was exactly what I needed. The first night, I sat on the porch and watched the stars come out. The darkness here was absolute. No distant glow of city lights. No noise except for the occasional whisper of wind through the trees. It should have been peaceful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I tried to ignore it. I went inside, bolted the door, and climbed into my sleeping bag. But I didn't sleep well. The next morning, I woke early, my back stiff from the thin mattress. I made coffee over the small propane stove I had brought and stepped outside to drink it. The forest was bathed in pale morning light, the air cool against my skin. I decided to explore. I followed a narrow trail that led deeper into the woods, winding between the trees. The ground was uneven, covered in thick layers of fallen leaves. About a mile in, I found something strange. Clearing. First, it seemed normal, just an open space surrounded by trees. But as I stepped closer, I noticed something. The ground had been disturbed. There were patches of dirt that had been dug up, shallow holes scattered throughout the clearing. Some of them looked recent, the soil loose, the edges sharp. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. Why would someone be digging out here? I looked around, suddenly feeling exposed. The trees loomed around me, dark and silent. I turned and headed back to the cabin, walking faster than before. That night, I couldn't relax. I sat inside with the lantern burning low, listening. The woods outside were silent, too silent. Then, just past midnight, I heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving around the cabin. My breath caught in my throat. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. I sat completely still, heart pounding. Minutes passed. Then, finally, I heard movement again. The footsteps retreated, fading into the trees. I didn't sleep at all. To first light, I packed my gear. I wasn't going to stay another night. I stepped outside, scanning the trees. Nothing. Then I saw it. Near the edge of the clearing, where the trail led back to my truck. Fresh footprints in the dirt. Not mine. Someone had been out here, watching. I tightened the straps on my pack and started walking. Fast. The whole way back, I kept checking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone following. But the trail remained empty. When I finally reached my truck, I threw my gear in the back and climbed inside, locking the doors. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. As I turned onto the main road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. A figure stood at the edge of the trees, watching. I didn't stop. I never went back.